So in this video, we're going to have a look at the context of blood brothers. And by that, we mean the social, historical and cultural context. So what was happening in society at the time? What about the historical factors? How did society change throughout history during the play? And what were the cultures like? Now, we're going to touch on that in this recording, but also future lessons are going to look at those in more detail too. Okay, so let's have a look. We are going to start with a playwright, Willie Russell. It's a very good place to start. He was born in Liverpool, you see. So he is a man of the city and he feels that he's got something to say. He was born in 1947, so just after the war. So while he was growing up, he would have seen the housing stock of Liverpool being completely in disrepair. I say completely, that's probably over exaggerating. There was probably a lot of disrepair. Why? Well, we just had World War II and Liverpool was heavily bombed and some areas were decimated and the process of getting it all repaired again took time. So he saw Liverpool with the housing stock needing work. So that makes you think about the people who were living in those houses at the time. He was from a working class background himself. So that's the sort of one of the obviously factors in Blood Brothers, the class, the working class being middle class. He left school with no qualifications at 15, and then he did lots of various low paid jobs, and often they were difficult too, as they often are with low paid jobs. And then he decided to go back to school and trained to become a teacher. So that's Willie Russell. But during his life, he found questions arising in his mind. He thought, is it a person's own fault for being poor and having lower opportunities in life? Or on the right-hand side, is a person really the product of their environment? So that means the environment makes you. So the social background, maybe being rich or poor, does it shape a person so much that they can't really escape it? Now, that's a very interesting question. It comes down to nature and nurture. Nature on the left, this is the way you're made and this is how you are. But on the right, nurture, that's society shaping you. So he wanted to write a play that explored these questions, especially from the viewpoint of the working class, the poorer people's lives. And he actually said, I want to talk about things that matter. We've got a lovely picture of the Liverpool skyline there. You see that often in stage design for Blood Brothers. They often use that backlit against the cyclorama on stage. So we decided to write this play, Blood Brothers, and it opened in Liverpool in 1983 at the Liverpool Playhouse. So written by a Liverpudlian, a Scouser, and it premiered in Liverpool, and then it went on to the West End. It was one of the longest running and most successful West End musicals ever. It started life not as a musical, however. There was a studio version that was written and then it developed into a musical. So, one thing we do know about Willie Russell is he is politically left wing. Now, this is a big part of the viewpoint in his play. So it's a really interesting, I suppose, cultural and social factor to look at. Let's think about what left wing might mean. You might have some knowledge of this already, you might not, and that's absolutely fine. So if we look at the left side there, we've got left wing, we've got Labour. At the moment, it's Keir Starmer who's leading the Labour Party. We've had Jeremy Corbyn. In the past, you might have heard of Tony Blair. And on the right-hand side there, we've got the Conservatives with Boris Johnson. You might have heard of a previous Prime Minister from the 1980s called Margaret Thatcher. And the colours are generally about right there. So left wing, Labour Party, they tend to be red, and right wing, blue. So what's the difference in their political angle? What do they think about society? Most importantly, how do both wings think that the problems in society can be solved? Well, the left wing angle is, let's focus on society as a whole. Let's see society made up of individuals, but those individuals are part of a whole. So whatever happens to one person, it could happen to somebody else. We're seeing everybody as connected. So their point of view is make a bigger government that gives businesses less power. Now, of course, this will change depending on who is in power at the time, but this is broadly true. So less power for businesses, more power for government, and all people, regardless of who they are, should get support. So that's the welfare state, that's disability, that's universal credit, that's maybe Sure Start centres for children who need extra help as they're growing up. That's free school meals, pupil premium, that's all these sorts of things. And their beliefs are one for all and all for one. It's all about equality, help those who can't help themselves. So if you are left wing, you believe that government should spend more on society so that everyone has got a chance to achieve their potential. And that is often raised through taxation. It might not just be taxing businesses, it's generally about taxing businesses and people who earn more. So the taxation raises money and they spend it on the people. That is the left-wing point of view. The right-wing point of view is that it focuses on individuals. So you can see there's a difference there straight away. Left-wing, society, right-wing is about individuals. So you might think, well, society is made up of individuals. Why is that different? Well, when we focus on individuals, we're starting to think about what they personally can do for themselves to help themselves. Okay, so we're thinking about making a smaller government, giving businesses more power, tending to bring in privatisation. That means education and schools and the NHS and lots of different services in society are privatised, meaning companies and businesses run them and then they can take profit from them. People can afford to pay for what they deserve based on what they earn. So the right-wing point of view is you deserve the service you get according to how much you can afford to pay. Now that comes from the idea that if you work harder, you will get more money. So it's down to you to work hard to get more money to be able to afford the things that you want or need. Whereas the left-wing angle is there is a safety net for everybody, whether you can afford to pay or not. So the right-wing belief is about survival of the fittest. It's down to you whether you achieve or fail. And therefore, if it's down to you, governments can spend less on society. So the general right-wing point of view is to shrink the government more than the left-wing who think grow the government more. Again, I must keep saying that this really does depend on who is in power, because Boris Johnson is going to see things very differently to Jeremy Corbyn, or who would have seen things very different to Thatcher. And, you know, everybody has their own point of view on it. This is broadly true, okay? So the little tagline for the right-wing politicians here, don't tax and spend. So tax less, so people get to keep more of their own money, and people will get more benefits in society by helping themselves by working harder. The harder you work, the more you deserve. Compare that to the left-wing view. The government should help all people, regardless of how much you earn. Okay, so this comes across in the play Blood Brothers. Because if we go back to these two questions again, it's broadly a left-wing and a right-wing point of view. That question, should society have a duty to stop poverty and give everyone, not just the rich few, opportunities? That's a, you know, that is a left-wing question. And that's where Willie Russell sits. Okay, the other one on the right, if it's your responsibility for being poor and having lower opportunities, that's a right-wing viewpoint. These come up in the play Blood Brothers. Okay, so we're going to look at this and many other themes over the next few sessions. So now let's look at the social and historical setting of Blood Brothers. It's set in Liverpool and it's sort of set between the late 1950s to the mid 1980s. The social and historical and cultural changes were really important in this time period, and Willie Russell really wanted to explore this in Blood Brothers. We had great changes in the 1950s after the war, and then money started to roll out again, rationing stopped. We had these sorts of changes. We had icons like we can see Marilyn Monroe in the top corner here, very important figure. You know, men and women looked up to her. She was considered to be beautiful, but yet also a tragic figure. And as you know, Blood Brothers is a tragic play. So that is a similar theme there and a similar sort of cycle of life and a journey of life to the icon Marilyn Monroe. We went from, during this period, we went from people living in strong, sort of busy, quite crowded communities to being slum cleared and moved to the country. We'll look at that in a minute. Okay, that changed the culture. And we also looked at Margaret Thatcher coming in, who really espoused this right-wing point of view about you being responsible for your changes and your look in life. So let's look at the historical timeline of the play. Let's go right back to the late 1950s and early 1960s. All these pictures are from Liverpool slums in this era. So during this time, the working class people were poor. There were jobs, but it was still recovering from the war. There was a slow downturn in the economy, and there was growing unemployment after the war. But people still generally had jobs. But you can see the sorts of houses they were living in. They're overcrowded, back to backs, meaning no back garden, just another house at the back wall of your house. Lots of rubble, we could still see signs of bomb damage. The housing stock was very poor. We had damp, we had peeling wallpaper, holes in roofs. These are the sorts of houses that people lived in, and the sort of house that Mrs. Johnston and her family would have lived in. So unemployment started to rise as the docks started to lose business. So in Liverpool, obviously, it is on the sea, okay? The River Mersey runs, it's the estuary of the River Mersey is between Liverpool and Birkenhead over the river there. That's all Merseyside, and then we've got the sea. So it used to have this great port, the port and the docks of Liverpool, and that's where ships sailed from for hundreds of years. But things started to change. The docks started to lose business. We had the slow rise of the air industry, which gradually started to be able to take big things like it's called freight. We had the Manchester Ship Canal, meaning that you didn't have to stop your goods off at Liverpool. You could just bring your goods right down the Ship Canal, going straight past Liverpool, waving goodbye as you went to Rachel, and get your stuff into Manchester there. So you didn't even need to go into Liverpool. So the docks started to lose business. That meant there were less jobs gradually and gradually for the Liverpool people. Okay. But we did have strong communities, and you can see that in these pictures here. Very strong, close communities of people. In the 1970s, the slums of Liverpool were starting to be cleared. It started sort of in, you might say, in the 60s as well. But for our purpose, for our play that we're studying, the characters go to Skelmersdale in the 1970s. So this is an example of a town. It was just built on green fields in Lancashire. And it offered new hope to families. They thought it's a brand new start, but on the other hand, it did devastate family links. Communities were torn apart, but it did provide better housing. And here are some pictures from the time period. Some children playing in the courtyard. This is a group of families who are having a little look round the new town of Skelmersdale. They've all got the best clothes on and they're all having a big outing. Wow, look, front door with a porch. It's even got a number on the door. You can imagine the curtains, the new materials. It was so exciting at the time for these people to see this rather than the slums that they've been living in. Someone even had a car. Look at this. And looking that reminds me of sort of council estates that I grew up in as a child. You can see all the houses were the same. They had a porch, but we had more space in front of the houses, sort of green spaces that you will start to get on council estates. Those typical lampposts of the era. So there were more communal spaces, paved areas where people could talk, meet. And these were for the slightly more wealthy people of Skelmersdale. Those lampposts are a bit more high tech, actually, if you look at them. More cars. All got a garden. So these are for sort of upper working class people. Not the middle classes, but the upper working class people, you would say. And then by the time we get to the late 1970s, the docks closed in Liverpool. They were a traditional source of local employment, but they were allowed to run down, and there we had thousands of people not having jobs. Okay, they eventually closed, as we've said. It started earlier, but this is when it finally could not continue anymore. And as soon as we started to get the lack of employment, so lots of people were unemployed, then we started to see signs of poverty, of people being too poor to be able to afford what they needed. So as a result, some areas there was some crime increases. Housing deteriorated even further because people couldn't afford to mend their houses or keep up the maintenance. We had illegal drug use, and drinking became much more common. And other large employers started to close businesses too. There was what we call an economic downturn in the whole of England. But because Liverpool had the docks, and that was such a big employer, when they closed, unemployment hit Liverpool much, much more. We've got some lovely pictures here. They are from the Liverpool docks at the time. The one on the top right, we can just start to see somebody's watching the docks being sort of wound down and closed. We can see the skyline of Liverpool in the background. The bottom right picture there, we've got a group of kids who are out playing. They would be playing in the docks. Again, it was very common to live your life outside as a child. You'd be out all day, just go back in for the odd drink of water and, a bit of scouse, a little bit of stew, and then spend your time with your friends. And that meant often exploring building sites, abandoned buildings, all very, very interesting for young children, obviously not that safe either. But you can see them stood here looking like a little happy gang, and they're all standing on this cobbled surface. You can see the cobbles there. It's a particular type of flooring. And then on the left, we can see an old oil drum and a ladder. That's the abandoned docks. In 1979, we had Margaret Thatcher coming into power as the British Prime Minister. She was the first female Prime Minister. And she closed many more factories. She was not interested in keeping employment high. Well, that you think, why? Why would you, as a Prime Minister, not want to put people in jobs? Well, she had a reason for that, and her reason was if more people are unemployed, goods become cheaper. So whatever you might buy, whether it might be a loaf of bread, a pint of milk, a carpet, a coat, a fridge, everything becomes cheaper because it changes what we call inflation. Unemployment in Liverpool was the highest in Britain. And the people of Liverpool felt that she didn't listen to that she didn't take it on board, that they were suffering more than other people. And there was a lot of political fighting between her and the Labour Party of Liverpool. We had lots of people making protests and going on strikes. You can see that top right picture there. And they are wanting to have jobs. In years gone by, we've seen memos from Margaret Thatcher in which she'd actually written, "Let Liverpool rot." That is on BBC News if you wanted to find it. And she just felt that the people were too political, and there were lots of problems with the relationship between her and those communities. So it didn't end very well. Her particular viewpoint was each individual, regardless of their wealth or qualifications, should simply look after number one, which means themselves. She also said there's no such thing as society, only individuals and families. So she didn't think of society as a whole. She thought of people as individuals and family units. And that's as far as society went. So it's all about looking after yourself. And if you work hard, you'll get what you deserve. An interesting picture, isn't it? A symbolic picture. So the big message in the play is that even though the characters want to work hard, particularly Mickey Johnston, there is no job for him. So Willie Russell in his play wanted to show that Thatcher's belief about working hard failed if there weren't any jobs to work hard in. He tried to show that success is about having money and influential connections. So if you are middle class, if you lose your job, you'll find another because you may know someone who might own something, a business, or they'll be able to employ you there, or maybe give you some sort of help up, some little step up. And also you'll have savings to be able to fall back on until you do find work. Whereas for the working class, you are living from hand to mouth. So you would never have more in your bank account or more in your purse than a week's wages. So when that next week didn't come in, you were on the poverty line, the bread line, as they call it. And nowadays we see people who are having that level of poverty, having to go to food banks and things like this. And personally, I remember, my mum, when I was in the 1980s and 1970s, she went to food banks, and I remember being given tins of mints from the European Union that were going to go to waste, and bags of sugar and packs of butter. So food banks have to step in when people don't have the resources to feed themselves. So it's no fun, poverty. Willie Russell really wanted to make this very clear in his play, and he also wanted to show that it's not the fault of the individual. So you must understand that when you're studying this play, he's coming from a left-wing viewpoint. You might not agree with that. You might think the right-wing viewpoint is correct. That's entirely up to you. You are free individuals to make your own mind up, but it's important to let you know from what perspective the playwright is writing from. Willie Russell also wanted to show that the middle class were protected by their high social status, their power, their education, and their wealth. So even having the right accent, the right clothes, the right house, the right school or university that you'd gone to, all of these give you status as a person, meaning that you command a higher power and you can find opportunities quicker than somebody who doesn't have any of those things. So if you're middle class, you have more opportunities to bounce back when times are hard, which the working class didn't have. So if you think about it, or should I say, this is my personal point of view, Blood Brothers is a social experiment. You've got Willie Russell with all these questions on his mind, and then you've got two main characters who are baby twins separated at birth. One is working class, kept by his mum. The other is middle class, goes to a middle class family and grows up there. Spoiler alert, sorry about that. So what Willie Russell did was he had them born in the late 1950s, early 1960s, so that they became adults when Margaret Thatcher came into power. So suddenly we can see the impact of her social changes, like the higher unemployment, on both of these characters, and see how the working class and middle class people were affected differently by her. So Willie Russell believed that the working class people were purposefully left on the scrap heap. He criticised the right-wing Conservative government, particularly Thatcher. He felt that they only look after the rich and leave the poor to suffer. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Now, the problem with being poor is that it leads you to being excluded from society, divides people. We get this widening gap, and you can see it on this picture down here, the haves on one side, and then the people who have not. The haves and the have-nots. So when you are suffering from social exclusion, you don't get the same healthcare or education as the people who are wealthier. You don't have the same diet. You don't have the same access to books, to cultural things like being able to go out, going to, like nowadays, it might be going to a concert, to a theatre, to go out to a restaurant, to have a meal or whatever it is. You don't have these same opportunities. So this limits you in life. So the lack of education and healthcare can stop people getting good jobs, which means they are going to have no income. Therefore, this can become a cycle for families, and some people have called this like a poverty cycle. It passes on to your own children. So when we're thinking about social class, it means how much wealth, influence, and status you've got. So down the middle, we've got a selection of a few things that we all have or have not. Let's see how it affects the working class and the middle class people. Okay, so remember, if you're working class, you're poor. Education, you're going to go to a comprehensive or a state school, like our school is. If you're middle class or richer, you have the opportunity to go to a private school because your parents can afford that. If you're like Edward in the play, Edward Lyons, you may well go to a boarding school where you can live there and again get all the extra opportunities that you could have after school, the cricket, the debating clubs, all of these different things that he had access to as part of being at a boarding school. What types of jobs do the different classes do? Well, on the left-hand side, we can see that the working class have unskilled or semi-skilled jobs. So this is working with your hands often, whereas the middle class and the richer people have jobs that have been, perhaps you've been to university and got a degree for, maybe like a doctor, a lawyer, or you might own your own business. Okay. Money, I think that's quite obvious. You don't have much if you're working class. If you're richer, you do. The accent can change. If you're working class, you're more likely to have a regional accent. So you're going to have an accent that shows where you are from. So that might be Liverpool, that might be Manchester, that might be, the East End of London. If you are middle class and richer, you are less likely to have the accent of your area. So, we call that, if it's very pronounced, we call that received pronunciation. It's almost as if you've received this pronunciation from your mother, your father, your grandparents. It's been passed down through generations. But if you're working class, you will have a strong accent to show where you're from. I think in my life, the most obvious example I can share with you is when I met somebody from Barnsley. Now, if you're from Barnsley, you've got a West Yorkshire accent. I'm not saying I can do it very well, but he sounded like this. Hello, I'm from Barnsley. I nearly fell off my chair when I heard him speak, and I had to share with him, wow, that is a very untraditional Barnsley accent. And he realised, and he laughed too, he said, everybody says that. And it was because of his social class. Housing. So the next one, we've got perhaps, if you're working class, maybe you're more likely to live in more crowded housing. It's going to maybe be, you're more likely to live in terraced housing, smaller housing, less bathrooms, less social areas, fewer bedrooms, maybe people sharing bedrooms, maybe you're living in flats, tower blocks. Less space, maybe not as much access to a garden. Whereas if you're middle class, there are more social areas, so you might have more sort of living dining room spaces for people to have the privacy and the space. You may have more bathrooms, you may well have more bedrooms, so you may be less likely to share a bedroom, and also the access to outdoor space like a garden. Of course, if you're middle class or working class, it will mean you live in a different area possibly, which gives you different facilities. Working class areas, especially poor working class areas, very poor working class areas, it's harder to buy fruit and vegetables in those nowadays. There is less access to fruit and vegetable shops in poor areas, but you can get a takeaway more easily in a working class area. Whereas a middle class area, it's easier to buy fruit and vegetables and there are less takeaways. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? Already you can see how it might affect your diet. When we're thinking about power, if you are working class, you have less power in society. This doesn't mean to say you can't change it. Of course you can. It's not all miserable. Okay, I'm a working class person myself, and I've managed to overcome a lot of these barriers. So you can do it. It can be done. Willie Russell is highlighting the difficulties. The social status and the power that you have if you're working class will be lower. You may be less confident because you haven't been to the sort of school that gives you the message from day one that you are going to be something. Maybe you'll be like your own mother and father. So you've got this sort of strong history to fall back on. You may not have that. So it's a harder fight. Whereas if you're middle class and you're richer, you do have this sort of, I'm going to be a doctor like my dad, or I'm going to be, a lawyer like my mum, or I'm going to follow in the family footsteps. It is completely different, the experiences for a child as they're growing up. Obviously, access to healthcare. If you are working class, you are reliant purely on the NHS, and you're less likely to have good health. At the moment, the current statistics are there's places in Glasgow. I think actually it's quite old. It's probably from 2010, something like that. But there are certain places in Glasgow that the life expectancy was lower than in Iraq when Iraq had the war. So that just goes to show that your social class changes your life expectancy even today. So it's something really to think about. Maybe more likely, in very, very poor areas, more likely to drink. Maybe there's more substance abuse, less likely to go to the doctors, maybe not putting your needs forward. All of these sorts of things that can give you barriers to healthcare. Whereas if you're middle class and richer, if there's a waiting list time for your NHS operation, you could just literally go and pay for your operation to be done more quickly. So obviously these sorts of things will give you different opportunities. You're more likely to have a good diet if you're middle class than if you're working class. We know that high sugary and fatty foods are cheaper. It's cheaper to have a packet of bourbon biscuits for 40p for your dinner than to have, you know, some sort of falafel wraps for £3 for your lunch. So go figure. Okay. And here's a picture to sum it all up. So on the left-hand side, we've got a picture of the slums in Liverpool from the 1950s. Children, happy children playing out. For them, it must have been really exciting to have this like strange landscape with all sort of falling masonry and stuff. Obviously very dangerous, but you can see how happy they are to be out. And also given that responsibility, there's a girl there who looks possibly she's 7 or 8 or something, looking after a baby sister or brother. You can see they're all out playing. And on the right, we can see a lady who is in a more middle class area. You can see the houses are detached there, and they've got ivy growing up, and she's got a lovely garden. She's tending her hydrangea plant there. She's got a lovely hedge. So we can see two different lifestyles side by side from the 1950s. And this isn't to demonise the middle classes. This is just to point out the differences. Okay. Thank you very much for listening, if you did. And if you did, well done for continuing to the end. And I hope that's been useful for you. Thank you.